Profitable companies from last year. One company earned more than both Apple and Microsoft combined. What do? They sell oil, and they're fully controlled by the government of Saudi Arabia, specifically the royal elite. This is the most profitable business of a vast country with a population of 215 million people. Brazil, another major oil player, also operates strictly under state control. And it's not just them. Norway, France, the UK, and India, countries with diverse economies, see their biggest profits coming from oil. Now let's look at China. Who's making the most money there? It's not Huawei, Alibaba, or any high-tech company. In fact, China's two largest oil companies, which are also state-owned, outperform all other sectors. Even in the US, oil giants like Exxon and Chevron bring in more revenue than automakers like Ford and General Motors. Meta earns far less than oil companies like Marathon or Joule 366. And why is that? Because for decades, oil has been the most traded commodity on Earth. It's not just needed to fuel your car. Even an electric one needs oil for its tires, the roads it drives on, and the plastic parts inside. Cosmetics, perfumes, and countless other products all depend on oil. Every second, billions of goods move around the globe, thanks to oil. It's the true lifeblood of the global economy, and not just the economy. Oil is essential for modern warfare. Without it, tanks won't roll, planes and missiles won't fly, ships won't sail, and soldiers won't be deployed. Take a look at this chart. It shows that over half, and by some estimates, 75% of the world's oil is produced and sold by state-owned companies. Why? Because oil is power. Those who control it hold the keys to the world's most valuable resource. But what about the wealthiest people on Earth? That list changes year by year. In 2022, Bernard Arnault of France, the owner of luxury brands like LVMH, led the pack. Before him, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, were in first place. Even earlier, names like Warren Buffett and Carlos Slim topped the charts. However, none of these modern billionaires come close to the wealthiest person in history, John D. Rockefeller. In the early 20th century, his fortune was valued at $1.4 billion, which, adjusted for inflation, would be around $340 billion today. What's more important than Rockefeller's wealth, though, is how he earned it. At the peak of his success, Rockefeller controlled almost 1% of the global economy, or 3% of the US economy. And how did he make his fortune? From oil. Rockefeller wasn't a scientist, inventor, or the first person to discover oil. He aimed to control every part of the process. As a young entrepreneur, he founded the world's first vertically integrated company, Standard Oil. He systematically bought out everyone, controlling extraction, refining, transportation, and sales. And that's what made him the richest man in history. 3 pillars of any business: production, logistics, and sales. Once you piece these together, they form a massive monopoly, an octopus-like entity with tentacles gripping American transport, production, finance, and even politicians. When it became clear to President Roosevelt that Standard Oil had grown too powerful, the U.S. government stepped in. It was clear that if this beast wasn't cut into pieces, it would soon run the country, not the White House. So under antitrust laws, Standard Oil was split into 34 companies. But John D. Rockefeller, already retired at the time, didn't lose a cent. In fact, he remained the wealthiest person on Earth. Standard Oil's legacy didn't die with its breakup. It lived on through the famous Seven Sisters. Though U.S. oil giants were restricted at home, they expanded freely abroad. By 1973, these companies controlled a staggering 85% of the world's oil production. If we assess Standard Oil's legacy today, its combined value would approach $1 trillion, with profits comparable to global leaders like Apple. This brings us to the most profitable company in the world today, Saudi Aramco. It's the financial lifeblood of Saudi Arabia, enabling the kingdom to project its wealth, develop grandiose projects, and even buy the world's top athletes in major sports events. However, Aramco wasn't always what it is today. It was originally called Aramco, an acronym for the Arabian American Oil Company. It started nearly a century ago when the Saudi king granted American companies permission to search for oil in the desert, attracted by their advanced technology and cash payments in gold. When black gold oil was found in massive quantities, it flowed to the U.S., but it became clear that the terms of the deal benefited only the Americans. Saudi Arabia was receiving mere pennies for its oil. American companies named their Saudi oil fields with great reverence, like Ghawar, the largest oil field in the world, spanning 280 kilometers almost and 30 kilometers across. They called it King Ghawar. Others were named Queen Abqaiq, Sophronia the Sec, and Barry the Great. These fields were a true stroke of luck for the U.S., as they were cheap and easy to exploit, close to the sea, and well-positioned for export. The situation was similar in Venezuela, which today boasts the largest oil reserves in the world. British and American oil companies were the first to explore these fields. The same goes for Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Indonesia, and Bahrain, where British and American companies laid the foundation of the oil industry, securing favorable terms for themselves. Local rulers received gold in exchange for access to their oil, with contracts stretching decades into the future. The oil companies were quick to set up rigs, lay pipelines, and transport the precious commodity across the globe. Meanwhile, these countries' leaders received a small percentage from every barrel, a deal that seemed reasonable to leaders unfamiliar with the full potential of their resources. In time, as more oil was extracted and profits soared, the imbalance became clear. Rockefeller's model of controlling production, refining, transportation, and sales had made the Western oil companies the price setters. Look at the historical oil price chart. Before and after 1973, it's like two different worlds. The 1973 oil crisis marked a turning point. The Arab-Israeli War prompted Arab countries to cut off oil supplies to the U.S. and its allies, causing fuel prices to quadruple in a matter of months. But the war was only the trigger. Oil-producing nations had grown tired of being exploited by Western companies, which, at the time, controlled 85% of global oil production. The oil-producing nations were providing the foundation for the West's prosperity while receiving little in return. Some threatened to nationalize their oil industries, while others hinted at military responses. By the mid-1960s, oil had surpassed coal as the world's primary energy source, and it remains so today. There's no clear alternative on the horizon, meaning the world continues to run on oil. This is the oil age, and it's still being shaped. You've probably heard of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Today, OPEC nations control about 80% of the world's oil reserves. These countries regularly meet to agree on production quotas to keep prices profitable. Many of these countries rely almost exclusively on oil as their main source of government revenue. Today, OPEC operates in an expanded format called OPEC+, which includes Brazil, Russia, Kazakhstan, and other oil-producing nations that also seek price stability. The first 5 countries that joined OPEC had one primary goal: to take control of their own oil reserves, which were largely in the hands of American, British, and other Western companies. Followed. First, Venezuela's leader, and later Saudi Arabia's, began to question the profit-sharing arrangement with American oil companies. They argued that too much money was being funneled to the companies with little going to the local governments. Threats of oil nationalization loomed large. But in 1945, during a famous meeting aboard the USS Quincy, U.S. President Roosevelt and Saudi King Abdulaziz struck a pivotal deal. In exchange for exclusive access to Saudi oil, the U.S. promised security guarantees to the then fragile Saudi state. However, to avoid outright conflict, the Americans introduced a strategy that became known as the Golden Handshake, a financial sleight of hand. The U.S. would ostensibly share 50% of oil profits with Saudi Arabia, but these funds would be deposited into U.S. Treasury accounts rather than given directly. It was akin to parents giving their child a debit card for allowance, controlling exactly where the money could be spent. This setup kept Saudi leaders satisfied while ensuring U.S. oversight. Without this level of unity, oil-rich countries of the East and South might never have achieved financial and political independence. Yet when OPEC later demonstrated its true power during the oil crisis by manipulating supply and prices, the International Energy Agency, IEA, was established as a counterforce. Today, the IEA includes even more countries than OPEC+, with 31 members, including nations like Norway and Mexico. The unifying factor? These countries primarily need to buy oil to keep their economies running. Together, they account for 75% of global oil demand. This gives us a clear view of the modern world. On one side, OPEC Plus aims for high, stable oil prices because its members are sellers. On the other side, the IEA represents those who need low prices to keep their economies afloat. Meanwhile, in the middle stands China, the largest oil buyer, and the U.S. with conflicting interests. Although the U.S. extracts more oil than any other country, it also needs high prices to keep its shale industry profitable. Yet, as the world's biggest consumer, it also suffers from those same high prices. This interconnectedness means that any attempt by one party to impose sanctions or restrictions on oil flows can have unintended consequences. A prime example comes from Venezuela a few years ago. At the time, the U.S. supported Juan Guaido in his challenge to the Maduro regime and imposed sanctions on Venezuelan oil. However, this created a major problem for American refineries, which needed Venezuela's heavy, sulfur-rich crude to produce diesel, asphalt, and other essential products. While the U.S. has abundant supplies of light, low-sulfur shale oil, it couldn't meet all the demand for heavier products, highlighting how vital Venezuelan oil was. This is where things get even more interesting. After the sanctions, U.S. refineries began turning to other sources. They briefly relied on Canada's heavy oil and even Iran's, despite the U.S. sanctions on Tehran. But the most surprising source of heavy crude became Russia. In 2020 and 2021, Russia doubled its oil exports to the U.S. as it became a substitute for Venezuela's supply. Even today, after new sanctions and price caps were imposed on Russian oil due to the war in Ukraine, Russia remains a major player. Despite attempts to block its shipments, Russia continues to profit from oil sales, as fully cutting off its supplies would lead to price spikes that could exceed $100 per barrel. Russia's extensive pipeline system and access to multiple seas make it nearly impossible to entirely block its oil exports. Moreover, certain European nations like Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Hungary continue to purchase Russian oil via pipelines such as the Druzhba, as they lack other options. And let's not forget the so-called shadow fleet, a group of tankers used to covertly transport Russian oil. The origin of oil doesn't really matter anymore. The only questions are about price and its final destination. According to the Energy Agency, back in 2021, more than half of Russia's oil exports went to Europe and the US, while only about 1% reached India. But 2 years later, the situation reversed. 57% of Russian oil is now purchased by India and China, two of the world's largest oil refiners. For instance, India now operates the world's largest refinery complex in Jamnagar. So what happens to Russian oil when it reaches India? It gets refined into gasoline or diesel and is then sold, often ending up back in Europe. This illustrates oil's global journey, from Russia through India, China, Turkey, the UAE, and Singapore, with its final destination often being the European Union, the US, Japan, or even as far as Australia. This is a perfect example of how oil has interconnected nations, turning the world into a small, continuously operating machine. Now, let's revisit the beginnings. In conclusion, it's not the oil itself that's harmful, but when it chokes out other industries. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more insights on the future.